Well, so we've got technically 3 classes left, but you've got 2 classes left with me because I'm going to be out of town on the timing just worked out this way. The very last Wednesday of the quarter, I'm in Florida holding a meeting. So Josh will fill in and do an excellent job. And yes, I see how it is. That's what it's going to be like today, Keith, huh? Yeah. Yes. Yes, we can. We can review last week. One more time. That's right. And you've got a list of, yeah. Keith wants to review. You got a list of questions. We might as well just go home. What are we even doing here? Yeah. If I have to listen to you sing happy birthday in that crazy way over and over and over again, you can deal with a review, okay? So, first, Paul and Barnabas' journey, short, small, then they split. Then from there, Paul will go one way with Silas. He'll pick up Timothy and eventually pick up Luke, making their second journey much larger where they head into Greek territory. Third one, after they have done that, will essentially, the plan will be to do the same thing. But on that second journey, you have several books written, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Okay, next journey. This one is geared towards taking up the need for Christians in the Judean region. And Paul's desire is to get the congregations to take up a collection and to raise funds to take care of those Christians, and then to choose people themselves who will deliver those funds. So you continue with the autonomy of the church, and that's exactly what he does. As he makes that journey, he'll end up in Ephesus. From Ephesus, he'll write 1 Corinthians. Then leaving Ephesus, he'll write 2 Corinthians when he runs in to Titus on his way back. And then eventually he'll get to Corinth, where he'll write Romans and potentially Galatians. From there, he will sail on back to Jerusalem. Okay, that's the review. How long did we take? I think your snarky little comments took longer than my review. I'm just saying. You good? Yeah. Two can play this game, Keith. Yeah. Okay. Any questions about that? All right? I want to drum it into your head so you don't need me anymore. That's the whole idea, so that you can go through and think about Paul and when he wrote the various things. But that now catches us up to Paul in Jerusalem. For some reason, this thing's not clicking anymore. I was clicking for other silly things. So, I had some bad animations in there. Okay, so now pick up in your Bible, open up to Acts. And Paul has now arrived in Jerusalem. What has he been told will happen when he gets there? He's going to be arrested. So Acts chapter 21, he has been told, you're going to be arrested. Paul says, look, I'm ready to die for Jesus. He goes anyways. Paul arrives in Jerusalem and he ends up going to the temple. Now, I will say, we're covering this stuff fast today because we want to get all the way through Paul's journey to basically Malta. If we can get to Malta, I'll be a very happy camper because next week is the last week I have to teach. And then we're going to cover Acts 29. What's the problem with that statement? There is no Acts 29. So we're going to cover Acts 29, even though there is no Acts 29. We're going to add to the text. Not really. What we're going to do is we're going to put together the things that happened after the end of the book of Acts, because that's also part of Paul's life. But here, he comes to Jerusalem, and he eventually goes up into the temple. The temple can be broken into several different areas. You have the large area that you're looking at there with those big open courts. Anybody was allowed in. This is both Jew and Gentile territory. Anybody could be in that section whatsoever. But once you move into the smaller area, not the building, but the courts around it, that rectangular area, that's only for Jews. And that little guy off in the corner is the fortress of Antonia. And that's where the Romans kept their eye on the whole thing. So you have several different parts of the temple, and in order to properly understand the story, you kind of want to know where they are. The large area, anybody can be in. The smaller area in the center, only Jews could be in. And that actually breaks down even further, where there's like the court of the women, where women were, and then there's an area where only men could go. But then when you get into kind of the raised, taller building, which, by the way, is where Jesus would have been standing at the pinnacle of when Satan tempted him, right? Satan tempted him to throw himself off of that, and what would happen? Angels will take care of you. If you're Jesus and you want everybody to realize that you're the Son of God, this is a great place to throw yourself off of, because everybody who's there would see and know that you're the Messiah because the angels saved you. Of course, Jesus didn't do that because he wasn't going to test God. We're going to do it in God's time frame, not mine. But that large area, the tallest area, that's where only the priests would go. That's where the burning of incense would be done, and the table of showbread and all that sort of stuff. But off to the right, as I pointed out, that's the fortress of Antonia, or Antonia. And that is where the Romans kept an eye on the whole thing. Because the Roman Empire and the Jewish people had a very mixed bag relationship. The Romans gave the Jews a lot of latitude because they had actually kind of made some treaties with them in the inception of the Roman Empire. So they had some freedoms that others didn't have. But the Jews have a history of rioting, mobs, problems, and not really towing the party line of Rome. So Rome said, okay, we've got this temple, we'll build it for you. And who, by the way, this latest version of the temple, the original temple is built by Solomon. Zerubbabel ends up rebuilding it along with Nehemiah, who rebuilds the walls of the city. But who really ornaments and builds this section or this time period of the temple out? Anybody remember? It's Herod. Yeah, Herod does it. Well, who's Herod? Is he with the Jews, or is he more with Rome? He's with the, what? Yeah. He wants the Jews to like him. He kind of has some connections there, but he's definitely following the Roman Empire, right? He's a political figure. So when they build this, you get a fortress right there. And that fortress is where we keep an eye on everything going on. Now, the reason I mention all of that is when you look in Acts chapter 21 and you get down to verse 27, it says, when the 7 days were almost over, the Jews from Asia, upon seeing him in the temple, began to stir up all the crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, come to our aid. This is the man who preaches to all men everywhere against our people and the law and this place. And besides, he has even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with him, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. So, the Jews, they see Paul in the temple, and this rock, by the way, is an interesting piece of history. If you read it, which you can't from the photo, and you also can't, and because you can't read that language. But what it says is that it's a warning sign. If you are a Greek, you are a non-Jew, this rock was right at the temple, and it said, if you pass this rock and you are not a Jew, you are going to be put to death. So they have historical evidence that the Jews had a right, under Roman rule even, if you had a Gentile go into the temple, they could be put to death for it. So this was a very big deal, right? Because the Jews it was important to them to keep the temple holy. And if you kind of go through history, there is a time period in which a Greek had gone in there and defiled the temple. And his name was Antiochus Epiphanes, and you don't need to remember any of that, other than it's kind of fun to say, Antiochus Epiphanes. But he had gone into the temple, had taken a pig, which is an unclean animal, slaughtered it, and then sprinkled the blood all over the temple. And the Jews referred to that as the abomination of desolation. So they had a very bad taste in their mouth at the idea of a non-Jew going into the temple area. So this was the agreement with Rome. You set up these boundary markers, and anybody goes past it who is not a Jew, you have the right to have them put to death. Well, that's the accusation against Paul. Paul has gone into the temple, and they say he brought a Gentile into the temple. And that immediately incites the mob. Well, what's the problem? He didn't do it, right? He hadn't actually done it. They just saw him with a Gentile in the city, which is not the same thing as taking that Gentile into the temple. This is just an attempt to stir up the crowds. And if you look at verse 27, who are the people who stir up the crowd? They're Jews, but from where? They're from Asia. The central area that Paul was in when he was in Asia was Ephesus. When Paul left Ephesus, why did he leave? There was a riot there, right? And so this is kind of, Paul has this reputation and connection. There's a hatred of him that's all over the place. And so this mob is incited. Now, what we will do is we're gonna jump through quite a few different things here. Paul is seized in the temple. The mob tries to get him, but then Claudius Lysias, who is the centurion who's in that fortress, he goes down, sees this mob, sees a riot, and so he says, let's stop this, right? Because that's his job. He's got basically one job. Look down at the temple and make sure no funny business happens, nothing crazy. He goes down, he pulls Paul out, and he kind of thinks Paul's one thing, but Paul's not. And Paul talks him into giving him a chance to speak to the crowd. So he goes and he speaks to the crowd, and they listen to him until he says one thing. What's the thing that he says? One thing that they're listening to Paul. In fact, in chapter 21 there, he starts to give his, well, actually, at this point, we're in chapter 22. He gives his explanation of his conversion story and why he follows Jesus and all the different things. But then, at the very end of it, in verse 21, as he's laying down, look, I used to kill Christians. You know me. I was on your side. But I saw the risen Christ. I saw Jesus. And he gave me a message. And he said, I want you to go to who? To the Gentiles. And when they hear that, they go nuts. That's it. Which matches what incited the riot in the first place. What did they tell everybody? He brought a Gentile into the temple, right? So this just hits the trigger, right? And so they go crazy. Claudius Lysias will take Paul away again and essentially save his life by having him brought into the barracks. And then he plans to have him scourged to figure out what this guy did. Because if you had that many people mad at you, you must have done something wrong. And the Romans were used to, when you're dealing with the Jews and you've got a problem, you just beat somebody. That's what you do. You just beat somebody till you figure out what the problem is. Okay? So they get ready to scourge him, and then what happens? That's it. Paul says, hey, I'm a Roman. Is that an issue? And it is an issue, and he says it because he knows you don't have a right to do that. Now, the average Jew, to Claudius Lysias's credit, the average Jew was not also a Roman. That was a rarity that Paul was a Roman citizen while also being a Jew. He probably should have checked, but that stops all of that. But then what ends up happening is there is we'll skip on down to chapter 23. The very next day, they assemble the Sanhedrin Council. Who are the Sanhedrin? That's the Jewish leadership, right? It's their Supreme Court, would be one way to think of it, right? They make all the big decisions. And they assemble them, and they set Paul down, and they put Paul right in the middle of all this group. And the first thing they do is they have Paul hit. Verse 2 of chapter 23. The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Now, Ananias just says, look, hit him in the mouth. And Paul immediately erupts and says, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit to try me according to law, and in violation of the law, order me to be struck. And so the first thing he does is he says, you don't have a right to do that, right? Even the Romans didn't have a right to just beat Paul. But then it's pointed out, because Paul apparently did not know this particular high priest, that the guy he just called a whitewashed wall was the high priest. And you know what Paul does? And this is impressive to me. When he figures out who it was, what does Paul do? He apologizes. He apologizes to the man who had just said, beat this guy in the face for no good reason. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's what it means when Jesus said, if somebody strikes you on the cheek, what do? You turn and give them the other cheek also. He goes, look, instead of focusing on all the things that the Jews and the Sanhedrin had done wrong, of which there's a pretty long list there, right? He goes, I did something wrong. You're not supposed to speak evil of the ruler of your people. That's the rule. That's from God. I did the wrong thing. Doesn't matter that there were 10,000 things that the other guy did. If you do something wrong, you did something wrong and you own it. There's like a whole series of lessons we could give on something like that. Yeah. Yes. Yes, it does. Yes. Yeah. 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 Yep. No. Matt's exactly right. The high priest system at this point, it's not following the lineage the way it should. It's being propped up by Roman politics. They're picking the guy. So it's all a trumped up thing, right? And yet, Paul says, if you're the high priest, you're the high priest. I won't speak evil. And it does. It really, you can think of a lot of reasons that you could grind your teeth and go, well, I don't have to be nice to this guy. He's not the real one. And so, yeah, that's a great point. He stands before that particular group. And then in verse 6, it says, perceiving that one group were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, because here's a council's made up of both Pharisees and Sadducees. He says, brethren, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I'm on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. Now, Paul may have to own his mistakes when he makes them and apologize. And he takes lumps that he hasn't earned, but it doesn't mean he's not clever. When he says, I'm a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee, is that true? It is, right? That's his history. Is he living like a Pharisee right now, though? No, but that's the group I came from, the political class, so to speak. He says, and I'm on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. Is that also true? Yeah, absolutely true. And it creates a big problem because the Sadducees are sad, you see, and they do not believe in the resurrection. You want to remember it. That's how you'll remember it, right? The Pharisees believed in resurrection. The Sadducees did not. And you can take that all the way back to Jesus when he was being tested. Remember where they asked him that question? A woman is married to a man, and then he dies, and then she's married to his brother, and then he dies, and married to his brother, and then he dies, and goes all. And then they ask him, who is she married to in the resurrection? The Sadducees were the ones who asked that because they didn't actually believe in the resurrection. They're testing him. So what Paul does is he says, I'm on trial for the hope and the resurrection of the dead. What does that do to the two political parties? It splits them right down the middle. Now they get to doing what politicians do best. They argue with each other. And so that ends that. And then Paul is, at the end of that dissension, Paul's taken back into the barracks, and that's the end of that trial. But then from there, the next thing that happens is there's a conspiracy to kill him. And so they say, let's leave Jerusalem. This is Claudius Lysias, the guy who's in charge of him, says, we're going to get you out. Who, by the way, was it who figured out there was a conspiracy? His nephew. Yeah. So you ever think about Paul having nephews? He's got family. He's got people who care about it. There's all this stuff in Paul's life you don't think about most of the time. But he had a nephew. It means he has a sibling. And apparently they loved him enough to make sure he didn't die. So it's just kind of an interesting thing about, when you think about all the things that Paul left to preach Jesus, you don't normally think he left his family. Because you kind of think of him as a solitary guy. But he's a solitary guy by choice. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Very big, yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah, so if you go down about verse 23, Claudius Lysias calls to him two of the centurions, and he says, get 200 soldiers ready by the third hour of the night. That's about 9 o'clock at night. To proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. Now, who are we transporting? One guy, right? We're transporting one guy, but we've got hundreds of men. The question is, that seems like a little bit of overkill. That's exactly the piece to it. Perry, I think, is right, is that we have a Roman citizen who is at risk of death and assassination by a Jewish conspiracy. This commander wants to make sure that he does not get that blood on his hands. He's going to make sure that guy gets to Caesarea. And so that's that map that we have there. You go from the black star of Jerusalem to the yellow star of Caesarea, and we can actually see that picture I have up there. That's Caesarea. It's technically called Caesarea Maritima because there's another Caesarea. Maritima refers to by the sea. It's the Caesarea that's by the sea. And the ruins of it are still there. The ruins of Herod's palace are still there. We can actually pinpoint quite specifically where it is that Paul ended up. And so, yes, he sends them, and he writes this letter to the governor at the time, whose name is Felix, and says, look, here's the guy. There's this plot against him. I want to make sure he didn't die. I'm sending him to you. Anybody have any comments or questions? Okay. So, starting in chapter 24, after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. They summoned Paul, and Tertullus starts to speak, and I'm not going to read his speech, but it's very lawyerly. it starts out very dignified, and he gives Felix lots of praise and all these different things. And in the end, Paul gives his response, and Paul also gives a very eloquent speech, says nice things about Felix. Turns out you can say nice things about people who are not Christians, right? It's possible to be kind and whatnot to everybody. And then he just lays out the facts. He says, well, they've accused me of doing these horrible things. How long have I been in Jerusalem? He tells you in that text right there. Go down about verse 11 of chapter 24. No more than 12 days. So they're saying, I've been involved with this giant conspiracy. I must be impressive. I made this massive conspiracy, and I did it in 12 days. And then he points out, he says, neither in the temple nor in the synagogues nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. Now, which is another interesting thing. Paul comes to Jerusalem. In the past, he was having conversations with people all the time when he's in Jerusalem. And that did stir things up, and he had to leave very earlier on in his life. Here, he says, I wasn't doing that. I had come, I had been in the city, but you don't have any witnesses that I've been stirring things up or anything like that. And he says in verse 18, nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. But this I admit to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So he goes on to say, yeah, there is definitely a disagreement between us. And what kind of a disagreement is it? Religious. And Rome does a lot of things, but they don't kill people because of religious disagreement. If you remember, that was what happened back in Corinth. When we were in Corinth, Paul was afraid they were going to do it, and this guy stopped him. He said, I don't need to hear from you, Paul. This is just a disagreement over religion. We don't have anything to do with that. You just figure it out yourself. And that's what Paul is saying. You don't have any witnesses that I was causing a riot. That would be a problem for Rome. You don't have any witnesses that I brought a Gentile into the temple. That would be a problem for Rome. All we disagree on is a religious thing. And we even both agree in the resurrection. What's the one thing that they don't agree on? They both agree that somebody will be raised from the dead and that there is a resurrection. They just don't agree on who. Just Jesus. That's the difference, right? And so he's couching it this way. And so he gives his talk. In verse 22, it says, but Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will decide your case. So Felix apparently had some knowledge about what he calls the way, which is what we call Christianity today. Now, why would they call it the way, by the way? Why would they call it the way, by the way? Sometimes I should think before I say things. That's right. Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one shall come to the Father except through me. That idea of Jesus being the way, it's interesting. We think of it as Christianity. But where was it first called Christianity? And yeah, somebody said, I think I heard Antioch, which is not Jerusalem. They weren't calling it Christianity in Jerusalem. They were calling it the way. They were using phrase like, oh, those Messianic Jews. They would call them that. They would say, you Messianic Jews. Meaning you're Jews, but you believe the Messiah has come. And so Felix had some knowledge about that, and he says, you know what? Let me get a little bit more information from the commander when he shows up, and he puts him off. And from that day forward, what ends up happening is that's basically Felix's life. What's he going to do? Put him off. And he puts him off, and he puts him off, and he puts him off for 2 years. And he'll talk to Paul, and Paul he'll have private conversations with Paul. And it says Paul would discuss with him Jesus Christ. He would talk to him about righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come. By the way, if you're going to talk about Jesus, what are you going to have to talk about? Righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. If you're talking about Jesus and you're not talking about righteousness or self-control or the judgment to come, you're not telling the full story. And Felix puts him off and says, I'll talk to you another day. And 2 whole years go by. Now, if you're Felix, those are 2 years where you are living your life. You are the governor, you are having fine banquets, you are traveling, you are handling things as head of state. But if you're Paul, what are you doing for those 2 years? You're in a fancy prison. Yeah, you're stuck. That's 2 years of that man's life. I mean, Paul barely stayed preaching places that long, most of the time. A long time to lose. And I say all that because you're only going to get one verse. In Acts chapter 24, verse 27, it says, after 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and wishing to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Imagine how discouraging. 2 years, and you keep talking with him, right? He keeps having these conversations with Felix whenever Felix wants it to happen, right? Paul's not in charge. It's whenever Felix happens to show up. But if you're Paul, you keep having the conversations, and you're hoping because Felix kind of gives you this sense that maybe he's going to get it. Maybe he's going to turn around. But then 2 years goes by, and his term as governor is up, and what does he do? He picks the Jews. He doesn't pick Paul. It'd be heart-rending. And you know, this is I understand he's an apostle. And there's a great respect that is required of us when we consider apostles as those who are sent by Jesus Christ. But as Peter himself said multiple times, we're just men. Paul's a man who just spent 2 years in a low security prison, right? It's not the deepest, darkest hole. But on the other hand, he doesn't have the freedom to do what he wants. He doesn't have the freedom to go where he wants. And all he has that is kind of this human lifeline is that maybe Felix will see the light. And he kind of keeps him on a string, dangling, right? Maybe I'll see you again about this. We'll talk about this another time. And then there's no other time. I just think it would have been gutting. And I don't know that. I didn't have a conversation with Paul, but it seems to me if I were in his shoes, I just would be absolutely gutted. So then Festus shows up, and then after he becomes governor 3 days later, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And what's the first thing that the Jews bring up when he shows up at Jerusalem? What? Yeah. Hey, we got this guy that your predecessor has been just kind of mollycoddling him. We want him back. Bring him back. And we want to have a good trial here in Jerusalem. Well, why'd he have to leave Jerusalem in the first place? They were ready to kill him. There was a conspiracy. There was a plot to kill him. So if they bring him back to Jerusalem, if you're Paul, what do you assume is going to happen? They're going to kill him. And that's not a crazy thought, right? And so Festus then ends up talking with Paul. And let's see here. We'll skip down to verse 8. After Paul arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. So Paul's not at Jerusalem, right? They've come to Paul, bringing many and serious charges against him, which they could not prove. So they are saying horrible, nasty things, which, by the way, I don't care if they can't prove it. If somebody says a bunch of horrible, nasty, vicious things about you, how do you feel about it? Even if it's wrong. You know, they can't prove it, but they are still saying it. And so while Paul said in his own defense, I've committed no offense either against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against Caesar, And so then it says, Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me on these charges? But Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. I've done no wrong to the Jews, as you also very well know. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything worthy of death, I do not refuse to die. But none of those things is true of which these men accuse me. No one can hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. And when Festus had conferred with his council, he answered, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. So when Paul is asked by Festus, why don't we just go down to Jerusalem? You know, we can just go down to Jerusalem. He's trying to make peace with the whole thing. He wants the Jews to like him. Why don't we just do that? Paul immediately says that's not going to work because he knows what will happen. And so he says, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal, meaning Caesar's court, a Roman court. That's where I deserve to be. I'm a Roman citizen. And by the way, I'm going to take advantage of my Roman right to appeal to Caesar. Now, if you're wondering in your mind, why didn't Paul do this earlier? If all he has to do is just say, I appeal to Caesar, and now all of a sudden Caesar has to hear the trial. He's just spent 2 years in this state of waiting. Why did he wait that long? Why? Anybody have any guesses? Yeah, you're on Caesar's time, right? So one, you've got to go to Rome. You've got to go through that whole process, which is not a small thing. And then you wait for Caesar to have time to hear your case. And while you're waiting for Caesar, you continue to be in this kind of low security jail cell situation. So he's already had 2 years of it. The moment he says those words, he's signing up for more. You have to think about how that would be. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I think you're right. I think, he spends those 2 years with Felix, and Felix kind of keeps him dangling, right? Thinking maybe this will work itself out. Then that doesn't happen. Festus shows up, and we're right back to square one, right? Yeah, you think we can get along with the Jews, get this thing squared away? He goes, that's it, I'm done. I'm done. I appeal to Caesar. It's the only legitimate option that he had left. But that's a gut-wrenching choice to make. That's a hard call because of what awaits you the moment you make that decision. You have that right as a Roman citizen, but boy, you don't take it lightly. Anybody else have any comments or thoughts or anything? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, this isn't, yes, isn't Caesar Nero at this point was what he said. It's like, yeah, that's true. Now, Nero has 2 sections of his life. There was a section when he was younger, and he had 2 men that, their names escape me right now, but they were good counselors to him, and he was less crazy. But he was never, when Nero was Caesar, he was never a good Caesar. You never said, oh, this guy's the best. He was just under the tutelage of these 2 guys. And then Nero will later on in his life get to a point where he has those 2 guys killed and he really goes off the deep end. This is in the better part of Nero's Caesarship, if that's the word, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, this is not a pro-Jew or pro-Christian Caesar by any means. This is not a guarantee to appeal to Caesar, to your point, by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, and I'm sure that's true, that Paul knew he would testify Rome. But what's interesting is Paul didn't know how that would happen. And I think to Perry's point, it's kind of like all the doors shut and finally like, oh, appealing to Caesar, that's how it happened. But yeah, and it also doesn't say what will happen after he appeals to Caesar. Now, the interesting thing is you get to the end of Acts and it leaves you hanging, but history tells us, and we have even from looking at some of Paul's letters later on, confidence that he actually is set free by Nero. He makes it out of that first trial. He'll then get captured again, and won't make it out of that one. But it is a, I mean, there's no guarantee other than you're going to make it to Rome. What happens next? Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay. So this is just a mock-up of Herod's palace at the time, and that was where Paul would have been kept. Probably not in the upper levels, probably more of the lower levels. But before he heads off, Festus will have a visitor. One of the Herods, Herod Agrippa, will come to visit. And I always bring up this chart whenever we bring up the Herods because I don't know about you, but you hear the name Herod and you know there's a whole bunch of them, but you can never remember which one's which. So here's this. Herod the Great's the one that killed the babies. That was a fancy animation. Herod Antipas was the one who killed John the Baptist and mocked Jesus. He also stole Philip, who's one of the Herod family, his wife. Herod Agrippa the First is the one that murdered James the Apostle. And the one that we're dealing with right now in chapter 25 and 26 is Herod Agrippa the Second, who's married to Bernice, and he's probably the best of the bunch. That's not to say he's great. He's just the best of the bunch. When the other options are the guy who killed John the Baptist, the guy who killed babies, or the guy who killed an apostle, you really don't have to work very hard to be the best in the family. But Paul will stand and explain himself to Agrippa, but Agrippa can't do anything. This is really just a chance for Paul to tell his story because he's already appealed to Caesar. There's no going back. Any comments or questions? Okay. Got 1 minute. This is as far as we're going to get. Paul's going to take this journey to Rome, 1,400 miles. It is not a short trip. It is not in an airplane. It's definitely not on the Concorde. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to be on multiple ships. And, spoiler, there will be a shipwreck. Not Paul's first shipwreck. Something else to consider, because Paul will write to the Corinthians that he'd been in multiple shipwrecks. And that's before this one. So Paul is very familiar with the difficulty that comes with this sort of a journey and how hard it can be. And yet, that's the journey that he's about to go on his way to testify in Rome, as Greg pointed out. That he knows that's where he's headed, and he's going to make it. Any comments or thoughts? Okay, then we will shut down there. Thank you all so much.